He turned pale. Not from grief, not from guilt, but from sheer disbelief. The request was clear. The response? Brutal. One word: no. What happens when a prince begs the king, not for forgiveness, but for $25 million in cold, hard cash, and gets slapped with silence? Not just silence. A strategic, surgical, icy silence, signed off by Buckingham Palace and orchestrated to send a clear, irreversible message. The bank of Dad is closed. Permanently. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But here's the twist. This isn't just some petty royal squabble over pocket change. This is about legacy, leverage, and losing control. Because Prince Harry, once the cheeky golden boy of the Windsors, has reached what some insiders are calling financial DEFCON 1. And when he reached across the ocean for a royal bailout, he was told, in no uncertain terms, to get lost. Not by a PR flack, not by a senior aide, but by the monarch himself, King Charles III. And if whispers from inside Clarence House are true, Harry wasn't just denied. He was humiliated. But before we dive into the brutal reply, let's rewind. Because to understand why this $25 million request was even made, you need to understand how far Harry has fallen and how desperately he's trying to climb back up. So the question is, what was he asking for? Why now? And why did Charles refuse to play along? Or the bigger question, did this one royal no just doom the entire Sussex empire? Let's unpack it. It all starts, as most royal dramas do these days, with a whispered leak. One line, one bombshell. Harry requested a $25 million emergency disbursement from the duchy funds and was flatly denied by the king. Now, if you're hearing this and thinking, wait, didn't Harry walk away from royal life to be independent? You're not wrong. Remember 2020? Financial independence was the phrase Harry and Meghan blasted across the globe when they detonated the Megxit bomb. They were done with palace control, done with royal duties, and definitely done with being paid to wave at crowds and open community centers. Instead, they build their brand in California. Archwell, Netflix, Spotify, books, interviews, docuseries, chicken coops. But fast forward 3 years, and here we are, a quiet financial crisis unfolding behind Montecito's grand gates. Sources say Archwell is bleeding staff. The couple's lavish lifestyle, think $14 million mansion, $1,000 an hour security, luxury travel, is becoming unsustainable. And that massive multi-million-dollar Spotify deal? Gone. Netflix? On life support. Their production company has reportedly struggled to launch anything outside the royal narrative. The Hollywood shine is dimming, and fast. So, what do you do when your brand is shrinking and your accounts are running low? You reach out. You go back to the one place you swore you'd never return, the firm. But this time, it wasn't for a title. Not for forgiveness. It was for a check. $25 million. And the palace's response? A flat, cold, calculated no. No emotion. No conversation. Just rejection. And it devastated him. Why? Because this wasn't just a denial of money. It was a denial of identity. For Harry, once beloved son, once war hero, once the prince who could do no wrong. It was a final, cutting confirmation that he was no longer part of the royal machine. That the bridges he thought were smoldering were in fact ash. But here's where it gets messy, eh? Because Charles didn't make that decision alone. The letter denying Harry's request? Insiders claim it was reviewed by 4 key figures: Queen Camilla, Prince William, Princess, and Charles's most ruthless private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton. A secret war council. And guess what? Not a single one of them sided with Harry. Why? That's where things get dark. According to multiple palace sources, there was deep suspicion that this wasn't a one-time ask. That $25 million now could turn into $50 million later. That helping him financially now would only further entangle the monarchy with Harry's chaotic post-royal brand. And, worst of all, there was fear. Fear that if Charles helped him, Harry might still go public again. After all, what stopped him before? A father funding a son's lifestyle is one thing. A king funding a family's potential takedown of the crown? Unthinkable. Still, for Harry, this was personal. He reportedly believed this ask was reasonable. that it could be framed as a royal disbursement from duchy funds previously set aside for him before Megxit. After all, he's still Charles's son, still a royal by blood, still father to 2 royal grandchildren. But the palace didn't see it that way. They saw it as a gamble, a trap, and they weren't about to fall for it. Now here's where it gets even more brutal. Not only was the request denied, but it was allegedly done with intent, not just to reject, but to humiliate, because the palace made sure word of the denial leaked. Think about it. A royal family famous for never complain, never explain. Suddenly letting this private request slip to the tabloids? That's not a mistake. That's a move. It was a warning shot. A subtle but searing message to Harry, Meghan, and anyone else watching. Don't come knocking. This castle door is closed. But what was in the letter? What did Charles actually say? According to leaked fragments published in a certain UK tabloid, the tone was legalistic, clinical, no warmth, no apology. Just a formal statement explaining that no funds could be released, that the duchy accounts were strictly regulated, and that the king was advised against involvement in private financial matters related to former working royals. No signature, just a printed name, Charles R. Some say that's what broke Harry. He had hoped, even after all this time, that somewhere beneath the crown, beneath the duty, his father was still his father. But what he got instead was a stamp, a cold royal seal. And that's not even the worst part, because according to one explosive leak, the letter wasn't even addressed to him. It was addressed to his legal team. Imagine that. You're a son. You send a message to your father. You ask for help. And what you get back is a lawyer's letter, without so much as a personal line. Can you blame him for turning pale? But let's not pretend Harry is blameless in this. Many say this was the inevitable fallout of years of public betrayal. Interviews, tell-alls, memoirs. From Oprah to Spare, Harry has pulled no punches. He's accused the monarchy of unconscious bias, of neglect, of cruelty. He's painted his father as distant, emotionally unavailable, even complicit in pain. And now he expected a favor? The palace saw the ask as hypocrisy, as hubris, as entitlement cloaked in desperation. But maybe, just maybe, it was something else. Maybe Harry was reaching out not for money, but for relevance, for a connection, for proof that he still mattered to the institution he left behind. And what he got back? A hard, definitive, echoing silence. Now here's the twist that hasn't been reported widely yet. This denial? It wasn't the end of the conversation. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Because insiders say Harry didn't take the denial quietly. He didn't just sulk in Montecito. He responded, not with a threat, but with action. He started making calls, pulling favors, contacting lawyers, old friends, even former palace staff. Why? Because if the king was going to freeze him out, Harry was ready to escalate. And Meghan? Let's just say, her reaction made headlines inside the palace. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What kind of moment pushes a prince, born into unimaginable privilege, raised in palaces, protected by an entire kingdom, to quietly ask his father for $25 million and expect to receive it? And more importantly, what kind of life unravels behind the scenes when the prince doesn't get it? Let's pick up exactly where we left off. Harry had just been hit with the denial, the rejection, the no, heard around the world, even if only a handful of palace insiders actually saw the letter. His face pale, his world spinning, and the question that echoed in Montecito and London alike. How did things get this bad? How does a man who once had access to billions in royal assets and influence find himself drafting a desperate request for $25 million? Almost like a corporate bailout, but personal. To understand that moment of humiliation, we need to go back. Not far, just a few years. Because the seeds of this request weren't planted overnight. They were sown slowly, painfully, and publicly. And the tragedy is this. Harry didn't even see it happening. Imagine the scene. A quiet morning in Montecito. Clear blue skies. The kind of sunlight that makes the world look gentle and soft. But inside the Sussex mansion, the air is heavy, thick. Nothing is gentle there. The financial reports have been bad for months. Archwell's expenses rising. Staff turnover accelerating. Multiple failed project pitches. Netflix executives growing impatient. And donors? Drying up. The mansion costs a fortune just to keep running. Security alone is the price of a small luxury car every single day. Maintenance, insurance, lawyers, PR teams. The cost of staying relevant in Hollywood, where reputation is currency and headlines are oxygen. And Meghan? She sees all of it, feels all of it. If the brand dims, the opportunities shrink. If the opportunities shrink, the money tightens. And if the money tightens, well, the entire Sussex machine starts to sputter. So that morning, someone brings the paperwork. A financial breakdown for the quarter. It's not catastrophic, but it's alarming. And then it happens. The moment the entire world will eventually talk about without ever having seen. Harry looks up, eyes tired, shoulders slumped. Maybe, he says quietly, it's time to reach out. To whom? You know exactly whom. His father, the king. But let me ask you something directly, because this is where the story becomes deeply human. Have you ever been so cornered, so pressured, so overwhelmed that you had to ask someone you swore you'd never ask again? Have you ever tasted that combination of pride, fear, shame, and hope? That was Harry in that moment, and it was Meghan watching him. But here's the contradiction that makes the story almost unbelievable. Harry, the man who proclaimed independence from royal money, is now writing a request for a royal bailout. Harry, who said he no longer wanted anything from the palace, suddenly needs $25 million to stabilize his post-royal life. Harry, who published a memoir accusing his family of emotional neglect, now needs the people he attacked to support him financially. The irony is brutal, painful, and completely unavoidable. But let's dig deeper, because the $25 million number wasn't random. Not even close. Insiders say the request included a projected 5-year security budget, funding to expand Archwell projects, legal fees tied to ongoing battles with the British press, restructuring costs for failed media pitches, potential investment into a new media venture, a safety net for upcoming periods of transition. That sounds less like a personal need and more like asking the king to prop up an entire corporation. But here's the emotional gut punch. Harry believed this was reasonable, because for most of his life, the monarchy was the safety net, the parachute, the bottom line. He grew up knowing that if he stumbled, the palace would pick him up. If he failed, they'd fund the recovery. If he needed resources, someone in a tailored suit would make a discreet call. But after Spare, after Oprah, after Netflix, after the repeated public accusations, Harry didn't realize the parachute had already been cut. He was falling, fast, and he didn't know it yet. Now let's talk about the delivery of the request. It wasn't sent directly to Charles. Not in the way you might imagine. A warm father-son letter, heartfelt, vulnerable. No, it was sent through intermediaries, advisors, legal teams, people with signatures, not emotions. A calculated move. Why? Because Harry believed a formal approach would appear professional, respectful, detached, as though he were asking as a representative of a foundation, not a son in trouble. But to Charles and the senior royals, it signaled something very different. Distance, coldness, strategy, transaction, not family. And that shift, right there, was what triggered the palace's most powerful players to circle the wagons. Because if Harry was willing to treat this like business, then the palace would respond like a business. And businesses don't fund liabilities. Here's where the emotional contradiction gets even richer. Harry thought formality showed maturity. The palace thought formality showed manipulation. Harry thought this was a pathway to reconnection. The palace thought this was a dangerous opening for exploitation. Harry believed it could open the door to a fresh start. The palace believed it was the beginning of another royal scandal. Two worlds, two interpretations, one catastrophic outcome. Now here's a twist you might not expect. Some insiders say Harry didn't actually want the $25 million. Not in the literal sense. What he really wanted was proof his father still cared. Proof that he mattered. Proof that even after years of conflict, Charles would reach out, hand extended, and say, "I'm still your father." But instead, he got the opposite. He got a committee, deliberations, drafted statements, caution, suspicion, distance, and finally, a letter that read more like a legal boundary than a paternal message. If you've ever wanted someone's affection but received bureaucracy instead, you understand exactly why Harry turned pale. But the story becomes even more dramatic when you consider the context of his life in Montecito. Harry had been isolated from the one thing he never expected to lose: his identity. In California, he became, slowly, quietly, and painfully, a celebrity. Not a prince, not a soldier, not a royal figure with clear purpose. A celebrity, a brand. And brands need investment. Brands need income. Brands need visibility. Without it, they fade. And Harry felt himself fading. Remember when he said he lost his dad in the process? That wasn't just emotional. It was financial, too. Because without royal support behind him, he's just a man trying to maintain a Hollywood lifestyle with 2 young children and a wife whose projects weren't landing as hoped. The $25 million wasn't just money. It was survival, a last resort, a Hail Mary. But Charles didn't see it that way. And why should he? From the palace perspective, Harry had publicly branded them cold, racist, outdated, cruel, emotionally stunted, and dangerous. He sold millions of books describing internal family wounds. He called out Camilla. He exposed William. He criticized the institution. And now he wanted a check? The palace believed giving him money would be the equivalent of rewarding betrayal. And so the rejection wasn't just rejection. It was punishment, a message, a boundary, a declaration that the monarchy had moved on without him. And that's what made his face go pale. For the first time in his life, the monarchy wasn't coming to save him. He was on his own. But the real explosion wasn't the denial. No, the real explosion was what Harry decided to do next. Because in the hours following that letter, after the humiliation, after the silence, after the realization of what this meant, Harry began making calls. Not to friends, not to allies, not to business partners, to people who hadn't heard from him in years. People who understood the palace better than anyone. Former aides, former advisors, former insiders. He wanted help. He wanted answers. And he wanted a strategy. Because if the king wasn't going to support him, Harry was prepared to make moves no one expected. Moves that could destabilize both worlds he lived in, royal and Hollywood. Moves that could deepen the divide or blow everything open. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the $25 million request wasn't really Harry's idea, but Meghan's? And here's the more uncomfortable question. If Meghan was the architect behind the ask, what exactly was her endgame? Because palace insiders aren't whispering, they're insisting that Meghan's fingerprints were all over this. From the tone, from the structure, from the timing, even from the wording. And when we dig into why, things get even more explosive. Let's pick up right where we left off. Harry is making calls. Panicked, pale, shocked. But Meghan? Meghan isn't stunned in the same way. Not even close. While Harry is spiraling emotionally, Meghan is calculating, processing, reframing the situation as something they can still control. Or at least, something she thinks they can. Because according to multiple sources close to Montecito, Meghan believed that reaching out to Charles wasn't just a necessary move. It was a strategic one she had been quietly preparing for months. But how? Why? And what did she hope to gain? Let's go layer by layer. Imagine the Sussex mansion again. But this time, focus not on Harry pacing, but on Meghan watching him, studying him, understanding the emotional crack forming beneath his carefully constructed California calm. She knows the numbers, the expenses, the trajectory of their projects, the cooling of Hollywood enthusiasm. She sees the shifting energy in meetings, the hesitation from producers, the cautious tones from publicists, the unreturned calls from executives. She may not admit it publicly, but privately, she knows the brand is weakening, and she knows something else. Without royal connection, their marketability plunges. This isn't opinion. It's marketing psychology. The Sussex selling power has always been tied to a single phrase. Former senior royals. Strip the shine, and what remains? A celebrity couple with a polarizing reputation, limited Hollywood wins, and a growing list of critics. Meghan isn't naive. She understands the machine. She was in Hollywood long before Harry. She knows how quickly the industry can turn on a narrative. And she knows that in a world built on perception, access to royal lineage, even symbolically, is one of the most valuable assets they have left. So when money tightens, when deals falter, when criticism grows, a question emerges in her mind. Could reconnecting with the monarchy, just enough to stabilize their position, be the reset button they need? And that's where the idea begins. A letter, a request, framed professionally, cloaked as necessity, anchored in the logic of security needs and transitional support. But beneath the surface, something far more strategic. Because here's the twist. The $25 million wasn't just about solving a financial shortfall. It was potentially about forcing the palace's hand. If Charles gave them money, then the monarchy was tacitly acknowledging their continued relevance. If Charles refused, Meghan and Harry could position themselves as abandoned, unsupported, and mistreated once again. Fuel for brand sympathy and future Hollywood storytelling. Either way, there was a benefit. But here's the contradiction. What Meghan believed was clever, the palace saw as manipulative. Let's break that down. Insiders say Meghan helped draft the messaging behind the ask. Not word for word, but through tone and intent. She wanted it formal, professional, detached. A request coming from the Sussex office, not from a son to a father. Why? Because she believed formality removed emotion, making the denial harder to justify. Think about it. A business-style request is easier to defend, easier to leak, easier to weaponize. She knew the optics. She knew the power of paperwork. She knew the leverage of appearing reasonable. And here's the kicker. She also knew Harry wouldn't push back. Not because he didn't have doubts, he did. Not because he didn't fear rejection, he did. But because he trusted Meghan's understanding of Hollywood strategy more than his own instincts about the monarchy. Contradiction again. Harry knows the palace. Meghan knows publicity. And in this moment, publicity won. But here's where it gets emotionally messy. For Harry, drafting the letter felt like vulnerability. For Meghan, drafting the letter felt like positioning. For the palace, drafting the letter felt like provocation. Three perspectives. One outcome. Disaster. Let's shift to the palace side now. When the request arrived, sent formally, with legal polish, through intermediaries, something clicked instantly among senior royals. This isn't Harry. This is Meghan. That wasn't just speculation. It was a conclusion drawn from patterns. Patterns the palace had been tracking for years. The structure of the ask, the phrasing, the timing, the financial categories, the PR-friendly narrative that could follow. It all had Meghan's strategic DNA. And for some royals, particularly Princess Anne and Camilla, that was an immediate red flag. To them, Meghan was the destabilizing force, the disruptor, the wild card, the one who encouraged Harry to distance himself, capitalize on scandals, and weaponize their royal past. Now here she was, repositioning herself through Harry once again. Or at least, that's how the palace interpreted it. And that interpretation fueled the cold response. Because when the palace believes Meghan is behind something, they shut it down. Fast, hard, permanently. But the deeper tragedy is this. Harry didn't understand that dynamic. Meghan did, but she underestimated its consequences. Now here's where the emotional contradiction becomes almost cinematic. On one hand, Meghan is fiercely protective of Harry. She genuinely believes the palace treated him poorly. She sees herself as the partner defending him from a system that never defended him enough. But on the other hand, Meghan is also fiercely protective of her brand, of their brand. She knows the Sussex identity is their currency, their livelihood, their seat at the Hollywood table. And if reconnecting with the monarchy, even superficially, could stabilize their future, she was willing to make that move. Not out of greed, not out of malice, but out of survival. Because when you strip away the headlines and the commentary and the speculation, there is a truth no one wants to say out loud. Meghan needs the monarchy more than the monarchy needs Meghan. Their wealth, their status, their media deals, their global visibility, it all spirals without that royal anchor. And Meghan knows that better than anyone. Let's talk about the private conversations in Montecito leading up to the request. According to one source, Meghan told Harry something like, "You have every right to ask. You are still his son. Your family still owes you support. You're not begging. You're asking for what should have been provided in the first place." Powerful words. Comforting words. Words that hit Harry right in the heart. Because validating Harry's wounds has always been one of Meghan's strengths. And in that moment, he needed validation more than caution. But here's where the contradiction cuts deep. Meghan spoke from emotion. Harry heard from emotion. And the palace responded with zero emotion. A three-way collision course, driven not by malice, but by misalignment. Let's zoom out for a moment. Ask yourself, did Meghan believe Charles would actually say yes? Perhaps. Or perhaps she believed that asking, even if the answer was no, was still a win. Because a refusal creates narrative. A refusal creates sympathy. A refusal creates content. And narrative, sympathy, and content are the three pillars of the Sussex media empire. Pain sells. Rejection sells. Royal conflict sells. Meghan knows this. Harry hates this. But both understand its power. And maybe, just maybe, the ask was less about money and more about positioning. But there's something darker. Some insiders suggest Meghan miscalculated badly. She believed the palace needed the Sussexes more than the Sussexes needed the palace. She believed denying Harry would make Charles appear cold and cruel. She believed public opinion would shift back toward them. But Charles, Camilla, and William were prepared for that. They had already accepted the cost of appearing firm. They didn't care about being called cold. They cared about safeguarding the monarchy. And so, when the denial was finalized, it wasn't just a refusal. It was a message, a royal boundary carved into stone. And Meghan? She didn't take it quietly. Behind the scenes, sources say she had a visceral reaction, an emotional storm of disbelief, anger, and incredulity. How could they do this to him? They're punishing him for choosing his happiness. They never supported him. They'll regret this. But the palace had spoken, and the fallout was only beginning. Because while Meghan's emotional response was loud, Princess Anne's response was louder. And what came next would drag this family feud into a realm no one was prepared for. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the most decisive hand behind Harry's $25 million denial didn't belong to King Charles, but Queen Camilla? And what if her quiet influence, once dismissed as ceremonial, was now sharp enough to shape royal policy, sever family ties, and redefine the balance of power within the monarchy itself? Because according to multiple palace insiders, by the time Charles even saw the request, Camilla had already made up her mind. And once she did, everyone else, including the king, followed her lead. Let's pick up right from the last cliffhanger. Harry and Meghan are spinning. The rejection has landed. Emotions are raw. Meghan is furious. Harry is heartbroken. Montecito is in panic mode. But 5,000 miles away, behind the towering gates of Clarence House, a very different mood is unfolding. Not panic. Not rage. Precision. Because Camilla, the woman once branded a royal outsider, is now, whether the public knows it or not, acting as one of the most influential gatekeepers in the monarchy. And she saw the $25 million request not as a plea from a desperate son, but as a trap, a high-stakes maneuver by the Sussexes that, if granted, would pull the crown back into their chaos. And Camilla? She's had enough of chaos. Now, let's be clear about one thing. Camilla doesn't write the letters. She doesn't sign off on policy. She doesn't sit at the center of every decision. But that's precisely what makes her so powerful. Because she operates in the margins, the silences, the private rooms, the conversations that happen before the official meeting starts. She doesn't need to shout to be heard. She simply needs to be in the room. And when the $25 million request came in, that's exactly where she was, sitting beside the king, reading over the message with a kind of cold amusement. Amusement that quickly turned to something else. Disgust? Suspicion? Contempt? Perhaps all three. One insider claims Camilla looked at Charles after reading the letter and said quietly, "If you give him a single pound, you'll never hear the end of it." Let that sink in. Because behind that line isn't just royal caution, it's emotional calculus. She knows Harry. She knows Meghan. And she knows exactly how this request will play in the media. If Charles gives in, headlines will say King caves to California couple. If Charles refuses, the Sussexes can cry foul again. So what does she recommend? Starve them of narrative. Starve them of oxygen. Respond like a sovereign, not a father. And Charles, emotionally conflicted, listens. Now let's talk about why Camilla's voice carries so much weight. It wasn't always this way. Once upon a time, she was the royal scapegoat, the villain, the third party in the tragedy of Charles and Diana. But slowly, strategically, over decades, she rebuilt herself. Not just as Charles's wife, but as a stabilizing force inside the palace. Where others played politics, she played patience. And now, she's queen. And not just in title. Because behind palace doors, Camilla is known as the steel spine and satin gloves. She smiles in public. She curtsies when needed. but she is ruthless in matters of loyalty. And to her, Harry's behavior, his book, his interviews, his accusations against her personally, crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. Remember Spare? Harry accused Camilla of leaking stories to the press, of manipulating public opinion, of playing a long game to secure her position, of being dangerous. And while she never publicly responded, insiders say she was livid behind closed doors. Livid and calculating. Because for Camilla, revenge isn't loud. It's methodical. So when the $25 million request came in, it wasn't just a financial issue. It was personal. A test. And she made sure Harry failed. But here's where the contradiction becomes explosive. Because Charles, the man who spent decades fighting for Camilla's acceptance, is now quietly deferring to her judgment. Not in every matter. Not in state affairs. But when it comes to Harry, Camilla has the final word. Why? Because she understands something Charles doesn't. There's no returning to normal with Harry. No amount of money will buy silence. No gesture will undo the damage. Camilla sees it clearly. And she makes sure Charles sees it too. You're not helping your son, she reportedly said. You're feeding a narrative that will never end. That's the moment the king stiffens. Not because he agrees, but because he knows she's right. And then Camilla does something unexpected. She picks up the phone. Not to Harry, not to Meghan, not to the press, to Clive Alderton, Charles's most trusted private secretary. She speaks with him for 7 minutes. What was said? We don't know the exact words. But shortly after that call, Alderton convened a small team of legal and communications advisors to begin drafting a formal reply. The response, as we now know, was cold, distant, impersonal. But that tone wasn't Alderton's. It wasn't Charles's either. It was Camilla's. Because she understands what so many still refuse to admit. The Sussexes don't want reconciliation. They want leverage. And leverage must be neutralized. Let's talk about the psychological warfare beneath the surface here. Because while Harry hoped the letter might trigger emotion in Charles, Camilla ensured it triggered strategy instead. While Meghan framed the request as justified, Camilla framed it as predatory. While palace aides debated the optics, Camilla shut down the debate entirely. No negotiation, she allegedly said. Let the silence be the answer. And that silence? It wasn't cold by accident. It was a weapon. A vacuum designed to make Harry panic. To make Meghan scramble. To make the public wonder. Because silence can't be spun. Silence can't be twisted. Silence is bulletproof. And Camilla knows that better than anyone. But perhaps the most brutal twist of all is this. Camilla isn't just protecting the monarchy from Harry. She's protecting Charles. Because whether you love her or loathe her, Camilla knows her husband's weaknesses better than anyone. He's emotional. He's nostalgic. He second-guesses himself. Especially when it comes to Harry. Camilla knows this. And so she builds a wall around him. A wall of advisors, of policies, of unshakable decisions. Not to be cruel, but to protect him from his own guilt. And if that means being seen as the villain, again, she's willing. Because for Camilla, survival isn't about appearances. It's about legacy. And Harry? He threatens that legacy. So when the request arrived, she didn't hesitate. She eliminated the threat before Charles even had the chance to blink. But here's where the plot twists again. Because while Camilla was orchestrating silence, Princess and was preparing something else entirely. Not silence, but a message. Sharp. Direct, unfiltered, because unlike Camilla, doesn't do diplomacy. And when it came to Harry's $25 million ask, she didn't just say no. She said never. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when the most stoic royal finally snaps? When Princess, and long known as the monarchy's iron backbone, sits at the table, reads Harry's request for $25 million, and reportedly delivers a 2-word response that echoes through every corridor of the palace. Absolutely not. Because unlike Camilla, and doesn't play behind the scenes, she doesn't do soft diplomacy. She doesn't cloak her fury in protocol. When and sees betrayal, she names it. When she smells a ploy, she calls it. And when a former working royal tries to claim millions from the sovereign grant system, he turned his back on. And doesn't just reject the request. She eviscerates it. And in doing so, she forces Charles, and the entire monarchy, to draw a line in the sand they can never walk back. Let's rewind. The rejection letter may have gone out with Charles's name on it. But before that ink dried, before the lawyers finished their draft, before Clive Alderton finalized phrasing, Princess Anne had already spoken. And when she did, no one interrupted her. Because here's the truth. When Anne speaks in palace meetings, people listen. Not because she's loud, not because she's aggressive, but because she's earned it. Decades of service, hundreds of engagements annually, zero scandals, zero ego, zero drama. She is, by every definition, the royal who kept her head down, served her country, and never asked for applause. And in Anne's world, loyalty is everything. So imagine her reaction when she's handed a confidential envelope. Inside, a financial request, large, detailed, and dressed up in all the polite, formal phrasing one could expect from Montecito. She reads the entire thing, slowly, word by word. Then, without a blink, she allegedly mutters, "He's joking," but she knows he isn't, and that's when she snaps. Now here's the contradiction at the center of this moment. Anne was once close with Harry, not emotionally open like Diana, not indulgent like the Queen, but respectful, protective, even quietly affectionate. She saw in Harry a spark of the real royal spirit, the kind that didn't chase cameras, but served, that rode horses, that saluted veterans, that made cheeky jokes but showed up when it counted. So when Harry left, she didn't lash out. She just went silent. But now, years later, after Spare, after Oprah, after Netflix, after repeated digs at the royal institution, he comes back asking for money and sees it as the ultimate betrayal. A betrayal not just of Charles, but of duty, of honor, of everything the monarchy was meant to represent. And worse, she sees it as part of a pattern of manipulation, a pattern of burn the bridge, then send an invoice, a pattern of using the crown as both punching bag and piggy bank. And for Anne, that's unforgivable. According to one insider present during the early discussions about Harry's request, and made her feelings brutally clear. He gave up his duties. He gave up his responsibilities. And now he wants the money that goes with them? That's not how this works. She didn't shout. She didn't rage. She simply stated. And that silence afterward? It wasn't disagreement. It was agreement. Because Anne, more than anyone, sets the tone when things get serious. She's not political like William. She's not emotional like Charles. She's not strategic like Camilla. She's pure spine. And when she declares a red line, everyone sees it. Let's talk about what Anne did next. She didn't just reject the ask privately. She began a campaign. Quiet, firm, direct. She spoke to Charles. She spoke to Clive Alderton. She even spoke to William. She made it clear. Any attempt to bail out Harry, even privately, would erode the monarchy's credibility at a critical time. If we give him anything, she reportedly warned, we send a message that we reward disloyalty. But her intervention went deeper. She didn't stop at financial rejection. She advocated for complete exclusion from future Jubilee events, from access to official estates, from inheritance conversations. She pushed for a formal position. Harry is no longer a working royal. He is no longer in the system. He is not entitled to a single pound. Brutal? Yes. Necessary. In Anne's eyes, absolutely. Here's the emotional twist. Anne isn't doing this out of cruelty. She's doing it out of fear. Fear that Charles, ever the romantic, ever the hesitant monarch, might buckle. Fear that one softened letter, one late-night phone call, one nostalgic memory of Diana, might cause the king to hand over the money, just to feel like a father again. And Anne knows where that leads. A cycle, a spiral, a monarchy dragged back into chaos, again and again. She's watched it for decades. With Andrew, with Diana, with Sarah Ferguson, now Harry. So Anne makes the case clearly. No more exceptions. No more loopholes. No more second chances. She doesn't hate Harry. She just doesn't trust him. And trust, once gone, is not a currency the crown can afford to borrow against. And here's something shocking. According to one source, Anne even threatened to step back from select royal duties if Charles reversed course. That's right. The palace's hardest worker, the most dedicated royal, the unshakable Princess Royal, was prepared to walk, not in protest, but in principle. And for Charles, that was the final straw. Because losing Harry is painful, losing Anne, unthinkable. Let's pause and reflect. You've got a monarchy under siege, a father torn between duty and love, a son in freefall, a wife orchestrating PR from Montecito, a queen wielding influence behind veils of diplomacy. And then you've got Anne, the one person with nothing to gain and everything to protect. She isn't building a brand. She doesn't care about Hollywood. She isn't thinking about perception. She's thinking about legacy, about survival, about protecting an institution that predates all of them. And in that moment, faced with a $25 million ask that would tie the crown back into the Sussex drama, she plants her feet and says, "No, not a penny. Not now. Not ever." But here's the cliffhanger. Just as Anne was drawing her line in the sand, Prince William was watching. And unlike Anne, he didn't speak immediately. He listened. He absorbed. And then, behind closed doors, away from the king, away from the cameras, away from the press, William made a private call. A call that would quietly change everything. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does it mean when Prince William says nothing? Not a word, not a gesture, not a quote leaked to the press. Just silence. Because in the middle of the $25 million storm, while Camilla maneuvered and hammered down the walls, Prince William stood still. But make no mistake, this wasn't passive. This wasn't avoidance. This was strategic. Because in royal warfare, silence isn't weakness. It's a weapon. And when wielded by the future King of England, it cuts deeper than any denial. Let's pick up right where we left off. Princess Anne had just unleashed her rejection. Ruthless, unapologetic, crystal clear. And while Charles processed her ultimatum, William watched. Calm, focused, almost eerily composed. He said nothing in that meeting. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he was still deciding how to say it. Because here's the thing about William. He plays the long game. Always has. Always will. And in Harry's latest maneuver, William saw more than desperation. He saw a pattern. And this time, he wasn't going to be caught off guard. Let's rewind to the early days of the request. According to sources close to Sandringham, William was informed about Harry's $25 million ask, but not consulted. He didn't find out through Charles. He didn't hear it directly from Harry. He found out through a briefing. A royal aide came into his study, handed him a document, and said, "You'll want to see this." And William? He barely blinked. He didn't curse. He didn't laugh. He didn't sigh. He simply said, "Of course he did." 6 words. Flat. Cold. Precise. Because William knew this was coming. He expected it. He knew the Montecito well was drying up. He knew Netflix was losing patience. He knew Spotify had pulled out. He knew the public was shifting. And he knew, sooner or later, Harry would come back. Not for forgiveness. For funds. And that's when William made a decision. He would stay quiet. He would not publicly intervene. He would not pressure Charles. He would not argue with Anne. He would not leak to the press. Instead, he would wait, watch, and if needed, strike. But here's the contradiction that makes William's silence so devastating. He still loves his brother. In some small, aching corner of his heart, the pain hasn't faded. The childhood memories, the grief, the shared trauma, the way Harry once made him laugh in the darkest of times. That pain is still there. But so is the rage. So is the betrayal. So is the cold realization that the man he once called his backup, his shadow, his anchor, has become the most destabilizing force in his life. How do you forgive someone who's still selling the story of your most private moments? You don't. Not fully. And so William said nothing. Because nothing carries more weight than a comment in the wrong tone. Nothing leaves Harry guessing. Nothing keeps Montecito spinning. And nothing gives William the upper hand. But William didn't just stay silent. He acted, behind closed doors, discreetly. One night, after a private dinner with Catherine, William made a phone call. Not to the king. Not to Camilla. Not to Anne. To the Lord Chamberlain. The palace's senior-most official in charge of royal protocol and finance. What was said in that call has never been officially confirmed. But one insider says the message was simple. If this goes through, if even a penny reaches Montecito, I will walk. Let that sink in. Because William, who has never issued an ultimatum to the crown, was now doing exactly that. Why? Because this wasn't about money. It was about precedent. If the king grants Harry's request, what comes next? More requests? Media leaks? Private security controversies? A re-entry narrative? William wasn't going to allow it. He spent the last 3 years rebuilding the monarchy's image, modernizing, streamlining, reconnecting with the public. He and Catherine have taken on dozens of duties left behind by Harry and Meghan. They've been the face of dignity, consistency, calm. And if Charles undermined that by handing Harry $25 million, it would undo everything. So William didn't need to shout. He didn't need to send a letter. He made one call. And within 48 hours, palace insiders say the final decision was made. No money, no contact, no reconsideration. And still, William said nothing. Let's talk about the emotional toll. Because beneath the strategy, there's something deeper at play. William feels abandoned, not just by Harry, but by the idea of brotherhood. He's the one who walked behind Diana's casket with Harry. He's the one who shielded Harry from press storms as teenagers. He's the one who covered for Harry's mistakes. And he's the one who begged Harry not to marry Meghan until they truly knew each other. But none of that mattered. In the end, Harry left. Not just the institution, but him. And William's heart, it never really recovered. So this $25 million ask, it wasn't just a financial request. It was salt in the wound. And William refused to bleed again. Here's a moment you haven't heard about. At a recent charity event, long after the rejection was made, William was asked by a private guest, off camera, off record, "Do you think things with your brother will ever be normal again?" William paused, smiled softly, then said, "We're both where we chose to be." And that was it. No bitterness, no venom, just fact, just pain. But here's where it gets shocking. Despite his silence, despite his icy resolve, William has been quietly preparing for another possibility. One no one is talking about yet. What if Harry comes back? Not for a visit, not for reconciliation, but for war. What if this denial of funds is just the beginning? What if the Sussexes go nuclear? Another Oprah? Another book? Another wave of public backlash? William's team is already preparing. Crisis PR briefings, security updates, a tightening of royal access. Because William knows something no one else dares say out loud. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. And Harry? He may be the one who's rejected now. But he's never out of moves. And William is bracing for the next one. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. No signature, no emotion, no explanation. Just a letter, formal, distant, and unmistakably final. And when Prince Harry opened it, he knew. The answer wasn't just no. It was never again. Because this wasn't a message from a father to a son. It was an official rejection from the crown to an outsider. And it may go down as one of the coldest communications in royal history. Let's pick up from the last cliffhanger. William had said nothing, but made his stance clear. And had drawn a line in the sand. Camilla had played the strategist. And Charles, burdened by years of grief, guilt, and conflicting loyalties, finally chose a side. But he didn't do it with a phone call. He didn't do it with a meeting. He did it with a letter, drafted with precision, reviewed by legal, stamped with the royal crest, delivered not to Harry's personal phone, not to Meghan, not even to the Montecito residence, but to their legal representation. Because this wasn't just a rejection, it was a message to the world. The door is shut, permanently. Let's rewind 72 hours before that envelope arrived. At Clarence House, a small group had assembled. Not the full Privy Council, not even senior working royals. Just Charles, Camilla, Sir Clive Alderton, and a private legal advisor. Their task? Craft a response to Prince Harry's formal request for $25 million in financial assistance from Duchy Resources. Their goal? Make it bulletproof. No ambiguity, no misinterpretation, no loopholes. This letter needed to say everything without saying too much. Because if Harry or Meghan decided to leak it, as they had done with past private messages, it needed to read as unimpeachable. So the wording became everything. And what emerged was less like a letter and more like a boundary carved in stone. Here's what we know about the contents, based on multiple insider leaks and tabloid confirmations. The letter was just over 1 page. Typed, formal, no handwritten elements, no mention of Harry or my son, just the Duke of Sussex. The phrasing was cold and clinical. It acknowledged receipt of the request. It referenced the non-working royal status of the Duke and Duchess. It cited previous statements made by the Sussexes regarding financial independence. It emphasized the legal structure of duchy funds as non-discretionary assets tied to institutional obligations. And the final line? Perhaps the most cutting of all. It is not possible to accommodate the request at this time. No further correspondence on this matter will be pursued. That was it. No apology. No regret. No explanation. Just a wall. And the signature? There wasn't one. Not Charles's. Not Clive's. Just the royal seal. Charles R. Stamped. Cold. Final. Now here's where it gets even more brutal. The timing. The letter was sent on a Friday. Why does that matter? Because the palace knew Montecito would receive it at the worst possible time for response. Late on a Friday afternoon, when media cycles were quiet, legal offices were closing, and damage control was harder. They wanted Harry to sit with it, to stew in it, to feel its weight. No reply, no follow-up, no chance to argue, just silence. For 3 days. And that silence? It broke him. According to a well-placed source inside the Sussex camp, Harry read the letter twice before showing it to Meghan. He didn't speak. He didn't yell. He just stared. When Meghan finally read it, her response was immediate. They're trying to humiliate us. She wasn't wrong. The letter wasn't just a no. It was designed to strip them of narrative power. Because for years, Harry and Meghan had built their public story around one central theme. The royal family rejected us. We had no choice but to leave. But now, when they asked for help, the palace had beaten them to the punch. They anticipated the narrative. They closed every door before it could open. They saw the trap, and they flipped it. Let's talk about the emotional impact. For Harry, this wasn't about money anymore. It was about identity. That letter didn't just say no funds. It said, you're no longer part of this system. You've lost access to the institution. You're no longer protected. Not emotionally, not legally, not financially. And most devastatingly, you're not family in any operational sense. That kind of message, wrapped in formality, hits harder than any public insult. Because it's not performative. It's deliberate. It's what happens when royalty decides to erase you quietly. But here's the contradiction that tears at the heart of this moment. Charles didn't want to send the letter. He delayed it. He asked if it could be softened. He reportedly requested a phone call instead, but was talked out of it by advisors and Camilla. Every time you speak to him, Camilla is said to have warned, he leaks it, or he twists it. Charles was torn between two identities. The monarch who must protect the crown, and the father who remembers the small boy walking behind Diana's coffin. But in the end, he chose the crown, and the letter went out. Now let's talk about what that letter means in real terms. Because it wasn't just a symbolic rejection. It set precedent, legal precedent. For the first time since Megxit, the monarchy has formally acknowledged that Harry is no longer entitled to financial support. That means no access to sovereign grant funds, no access to duchy disbursements, no justification for further requests, and even more importantly, it closes the door to inheritance adjustments. It limits legal claims regarding security. It establishes boundaries that future monarchs, like William, will likely uphold. This letter was more than a rejection. It was a lockdown, and it came with far-reaching consequences. Now let's look at the media angle. Because, of course, just days after that letter was received, it leaked. But not from Montecito. Not first, anyway. It came from a UK tabloid with long-standing ties to senior royal aides. That's not coincidence. That's coordination. The palace wanted the public to know. Not the specifics. Not the amount. Not the emotions. Just the fact that Harry had asked and had been told. No, it was a preemptive strike. A narrative preloaded before Harry and Meghan could spin their own. And the leak worked. The public response was swift and brutal. Headlines screamed, Harry's $25 million plea denied. King says no to Prince's last-ditch ask. Monarchy cuts off rogue royal. The public saw the palace standing firm. The Sussexes? Scrambling. And here's the irony. For years, Harry accused the firm of leaking to harm him. Now, the firm leaked to protect itself. And Harry couldn't fight back. Because to challenge the story, he'd have to confirm its truth. He'd have to admit he asked for money. And in a brand built on financial independence. That would be the final nail. So Harry stayed quiet. Meghan too. For now. But insiders say Montecito was anything but calm. The letter wasn't just a PR disaster. It was a strategic failure. Because now, future investors, donors, and collaborators would see the Sussexes as cut off. No access, no back channel, no royal clout. And in Hollywood, perception is everything. You're either rising or you're falling. And this letter? It made it look like the Sussexes were falling. But the real question now was, what would they do next? Harry, humiliated. Meghan, furious. Their options shrinking. And just as they began plotting a counter-narrative, an explosive PR pivot, they received another leak. Only this time, it didn't come from the palace. It came from someone closer. Someone Harry once trusted completely. Someone who, against all odds, still had access to the royal circle. Because while Charles was preparing for coronations, Camilla was playing politics, and Anne was standing firm. Queen Camilla's old rival had just taken a side. And her name? Sarah Ferguson. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when the royal rejection goes public and the world starts laughing? Not behind closed doors, not in whispers, out loud, in headlines, in late-night monologues, in TikToks and Twitter threads, and satirical cartoons splashed across British tabloids. Because once the cold rejection letter was leaked, the media frenzy ignited like gasoline on dry brush. And at the center of it all, Meghan Markle. And she wasn't just angry. She was incandescent. Because to her, this wasn't just a story. It was a humiliation campaign. A targeted, calculated effort to dismantle the image she had spent years meticulously curating. And worst of all, she had no way to control it. Let's begin in London. The leak dropped at 5:37 a.m. UK time. Just in time to make every major breakfast show, every front page, and every digital alert across the Commonwealth. By 6 a.m., the Daily Mail had it in bold type. Palace says no to Harry. Duke's $25 million request rejected by King. By 7 a.m., breakfast panel shows were already running segments titled Royal Cash Grab and entitled or misunderstood. By 9 a.m., political commentators and celebrity gossip experts were debating the story side by side, like it was both a constitutional crisis and a soap opera. The effect? Total domination of the news cycle. But here's the twist. The palace didn't have to say a word. The leak was the message, and everyone read it loud and clear. Now cut to Montecito. It's late. Meghan's phone pings once, then twice, then a third time in under 10 seconds. She opens her notifications, and her stomach drops, not because of what was leaked, but because of how fast it was spreading. Inside sources say she immediately called Archewell's PR team. The mood? Apocalyptic. This wasn't supposed to happen. They blindsided us. They're punishing him. Again. Her voice was raised. Her pacing relentless. Her tone somewhere between panic and fury. Because to Meghan, the rejection wasn't just financial, it was personal. But the leak? That was public execution. And here's where it gets even more devastating. She believed they did it intentionally, not just to make Harry look weak, but to make her look like the villain. And in her eyes, it worked. Let's talk about the headlines. Because while the British press roasted Harry as desperate, it was Meghan who took the bulk of the heat elsewhere. One tabloid led with, Meghan's $1 million mistake, Duchess accused of orchestrating royal bailout request. Another headline, greed in green juice land. Did Meghan push Harry to ask Daddy for $25 million? And it wasn't just the tabloids. Mainstream networks across the US, Canada, and Australia picked it up. Late-night comedians joked that Harry sent an invoice to the palace. Social media turned savage. The memes? Brutal. One viral TikTok showed a clip of Meghan in her Spotify podcast, overlaid with a sarcastic voiceover. I believe in strong women, unless they're the queen and say no to my check. Another showed Harry knocking on a castle gate holding a giant invoice with $25M plus hugs scribbled across it. It was ruthless, and it was relentless. And Meghan? She couldn't stop it. She couldn't spin it. She couldn't control it. For a woman who had once rebranded herself from TV actress to Duchess, to global humanitarian, to Netflix power player, this was her worst nightmare. Loss of narrative, loss of sympathy, loss of control. She tried calling key Hollywood contacts, PR firms, media friends, even one or two sympathetic producers from previous Netflix negotiations. But something had changed. Suddenly, the conversations felt colder, the enthusiasm more reserved, the promise calls back delayed. Hollywood, it seemed, had picked up the scent of weakness, and Meghan could smell it too. Here's the contradiction. She saw herself as the protector of Harry, of their kids, of their future. She truly believed that reaching out to the palace was a way to stabilize things, to build a small bridge back to legacy, back to resources, back to relevance. But now, that same decision had backfired spectacularly. And worse, she feared it proved the critics right. The ones who said she was calculating, opportunistic, a social climber. And in private, she broke down. According to a close aide who later resigned from Archewell, Meghan's reaction in the